CBT stands for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. This theory states that we have a set of beliefs. These beliefs influence our thoughts in response to any given life situation. And then from our thoughts, we have certain reactions. Our beliefs are developed mainly through our past experiences, but are also influenced by our genetics, our environment, and our culture. You can tell what your core beliefs are by filling in the blanks. I am, and then just fill in the blank. Other people are, and the world is. You can have core beliefs about anything. CBT looks at our cognitive processing and determines what are the patterns. Are there any thinking distortions? And if so, then we do something called cognitive restructuring or reframing to correct this distortion. The thoughts then trigger reactions. And so our reactions can be internal. They can be an internal emotional response or a feeling. They can also be an internal physiological response, such as your heart racing or feeling butterflies in your stomach. The reaction can also be external. That can be a behavior such as yelling, crying, or fighting. And a physiological external response would be sweating. And so when someone has anxiety or is insecure about their life, they tend to overestimate the risk of negative outcomes, and they underestimate their resources if the negative outcome were to happen. And so through CBT, what we do is we, first of all, develop an understanding and a self-awareness around what the distortions are, possibly negative core beliefs are, what the negative thought patterns are. We help the person develop some awareness around that. And then we start with a process of exposure to new experiences where they can learn to tolerate this risk of uncertainty and to notice when they reach for their resources and to encourage them to practice reaching more. So once they have enough exposure to new experiences that tell them that even when the risk is high, that they have resources and they're able to reach for them, then they start to develop new core beliefs. So whereas an old core belief might be I am unsafe because all of their past experiences have told them that the world is not a safe place, then they can develop some awareness around that and to see where they may be using thinking distortions, such as maybe excluding information that tells them the world is a little bit safe and overvaluing or overgeneralizing ideas that tell them the world isn't safe. So once they notice this pattern, they can start to have new experiences where they begin to notice that the world is safe sometimes, and they also learn to tolerate the uncertainty and the risk when the world isn't safe. So when we talk about these past experiences, you can look up here and notice that a lot of these developmental experiences can lead to the formation of negative core beliefs. So if a person was in an abusive or neglectful household, if they witnessed domestic violence, they might develop the belief, I'm not safe, or the world is not safe. If they grew up with a chaotic divorce and poverty, in a critical environment around drug use, they may develop the belief that I'm not capable of doing hard things because their environment is so limiting. If they were in an emotionally absent environment, or their parent was emotionally absent, or they had inconsistent caregivers, there was basically a chaotic meeting of the needs. So sometimes their needs were not met. They may develop this idea that they're not lovable and that they need to work to earn the approval of other people in order to feel this feeling of love. If a person had a variety of these, developmental experiences that were negative for them, they may have all of these beliefs to some degree and have this overwhelming or just general sense of I'm not enough. Another way that someone could develop an I'm not safe belief would be if they had a lot of health problems or health concerns as a child. They may grow up to not trust their body. They may grow up to think that they're not capable of doing hard things because their body has failed them in the past. And they may develop this belief that I'm not lovable because their body was functioning different than maybe their peers or the people around them. So there's a lot of different ways that you can develop this I'm not enough belief. But when you have it, it makes dealing with everyday life situations a little more difficult. So, managing conflict, having stress at work, running into traffic, dealing with politics or world crises, having insecure relationships and social media, when you're encountering any of these life stressors with a belief that I'm not enough, it's going to influence your thoughts in a negative way. And so when someone is managing a conflict or having a work stress and they believe they're not enough, they may start to think things like, things will always be this way. Life is so hard. When someone has a secure belief system that tells them, I am enough, I am able to keep myself safe, I am capable of doing hard things, I am lovable and worthy of love, that when they go into these conflicts or these stresses, they have thoughts like, there is a way to work this out, or I can listen and try to understand this other person. Thinking is more flexible and gives them more options rather than this one way thinking of life is so hard, this isn't going to work. Someone with this a real strong I'm not capable belief might think thoughts like, this always happens to me, what's the point of trying? So they may give up and not even consider completing a task or even facing any of these conflicts because they don't believe that they're going to be able to have a positive outcome or protect themselves from any possible danger. When someone has a strong belief that they're not lovable, they may filter these experiences through negative thoughts that sound like people don't appreciate me. So they end up with this what about me attitude. And when you have a what about me attitude in friendships or any of these types of life events, you end up sometimes what they call a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you believe that people will leave you out, and so you are hyper focused on that and may put pressure on relationships and cause the outcome that you actually fear. That kind of reinforces this negative belief up here, which is why it's so important to become aware of what these thoughts are so that you can work out what's behind these thoughts and not project them into your relationships or into your everyday life stressors. Because when you continue to do that, you are left feeling very insecure about yourself. When you're in this insecure state, you will often respond in a fight or flight response. We now know that there's flight, freeze, and fawn. And so freeze would be when you are hiding from the threat. That can look like indecisiveness, depression, hibernating. When you are in flight, you're moving away from the threat. That can look like overworking, using substances, being very hyperactive, and avoidant of conflict. When you're in fight mode, that is an aggressive response toward the threat. And so this may look like impulsiveness, perfectionism, OCD, controlling type behavior. A lot of people with an anxious attachment style primarily use their fight response. And then there is fawn, which is an attempt to please or neutralize the threat. This can look like codependent behavior and people pleasing behavior, which is very common with someone with a fearful avoidant attachment style. When a person can develop awareness around A, the fact that they're using these autopilot type responses, and B, that their own thinking patterns are fueling the thoughts that are creating this type of response, they can try something different. One way to develop self-awareness is to journal. And I'm going to go through some examples of how to use a CBT thought journal to determine if any of these thinking distortions you're using that could be negatively influencing how you're responding. So up here, everything is on a spectrum as it relates to the human mind and psychology. Most things you'll see kind of exist on some sort of a spectrum, with this one, self-awareness, being in the middle. And a self-aware person is able to take accountability, show empathy, they're very reflective, and they can stay in the present. They're able to name what's going on with them in this present moment. When someone says I'm too self-aware, or they swing, over on this end of the self-awareness scale, they would be considered hypervigilant. So this is someone who is very alert, very aware. They're often controlling and rigid because they're constantly looking out or aware of any threat. And so, because of this constant looking out, they present with a sense of urgency. So, they're always on that high alert. On the other end is this dissociated state. This person is oftentimes considered oblivious or thoughtless. And it's not necessarily that they're thoughtless or they don't care about others, but they're so wrapped up in their internal experience that they're just not experiencing the world around them the way others are sometimes. So they come off as aloof and distant. This behavior can look like uncaring, but again, it's not always coming from a sense of uncaring. It's coming from this, they're so wrapped up or so involved in their internal world that they're not experiencing it around them. So, what can you do to practice self awareness? That looks like a constant practice. So, it's identifying your thoughts and feelings. This can sound very simple, but can be difficult for others, and people often confuse the two. So, the feelings are emotions that you're having. There is a feel wheel at the back of this journal that helps you get used to identifying emotions. You can start in the center with these basic bad, fearful, angry, disgusted, sad, happy, and surprised, and go out further to get more descriptive words to describe your emotional experience. And so you want to practice identifying the difference between thoughts and feelings. So oftentimes when I'll ask someone, how did that make you feel? They'll say, well, I thought they were being rude to me. Or I feel like they were being so disrespectful. So they think that because they say, I feel like they were being, that it's a feeling, but it's actually a thought. It's an assessment or a judgment about the situation. And you want to practice identifying what your emotional response was to whatever those thoughts are. So this is super important to distinguish the difference between thoughts and feelings, and to be able to identify them, what your thoughts and feelings are in response to any given situation. You can do that if you're staying present in the moment and you're practicing. You also want to learn to identify your core beliefs, because that's going to teach you about how your thoughts and feelings are influenced. And you may also discover that you have some negative core beliefs that you'd like to change. The only way to change those negative core beliefs is to identify that they exist, and then again have new experiences that support new beliefs. So if all your life you've had all of these negative experiences that support this belief that I'm not safe, lovable, and capable, and each of these blocks can be a separate experience. So witnessed my mom and dad fighting. Dad told me I wasn't good enough. Grandpa told me I'll never amount to anything. He broke my arm when I was 12. Nobody cared for me. So all of these experiences are holding up these negative beliefs. As an adult, or when you're out of these environments that contributed to these negative core beliefs and you're in a new environment, you can start having new experiences that would support new beliefs. So if your new belief is, I am reasonably safe, or I have the ability to keep myself safe in this world, I am lovable or worthy of love, I am capable of doing hard things. So those are going to be your new beliefs. You need to have new experiences that support these beliefs. Sometimes people hinder themselves from having these new experiences because they live by these rules. If I mask my insecurities with perfectionism, people won't know that I'm not good enough. If I sacrifice myself for others, they will love me, accept me, fill in the blank. If I prepare and rehearse bad situations, then I'll know what to do when they happen. So the problem with living by these rules is you spend a lot of your present time either too far out into the future or too far out into the past. And when you're, thinking about the past, that's going to bring up a lot of depression. When you're thinking too far into the future, that's going to bring up a lot of anxiety, because you're trying to predict and control outcomes that haven't happened yet. And so this rule here, if I prepare and rehearse for bad situations, then I'll know what to do when they happen. That's false, because you don't know what state of mind you're going to be in the future. So even if you prepare and rehearse from the state of mind that you're in now, the plan that you come up with may not be relevant when this bad thing actually happens. So psychologists believe that it's better to stay in the present moment and trust that if you are in negative situations, then you'll figure out what to do then. You'll be able to reach for your resources and use your experiences to know that I am capable of getting myself out of hard situations. I am lovable and worthy of, respect and attention. I can keep myself reasonably safe. So when you stop preparing and rehearsing for bad things to happen to you, you start living in the present moment and you start having these new experiences that help support these new beliefs. But you would never know that if you weren't able to identify these patterns. So if you're having this constant feeling of I'm not enoughness or feelings of depression and anxiety and you can't figure out why, part of this process would be to identify some of these core beliefs that might be contributing. It's also a good idea to identify your values, because those also affect your core beliefs and how you think in response to any given situation that happens to you. So if you value, for example, respect, then you're going to be very sensitive in situations where you feel like you're being disrespected. So it's just good to know what your top values are, and you may need to adjust those. And there are also exercises that help with that as well. The tolerance step is learning to be okay with uncertainty and discomfort. And so the only way to learn that is to experience it. And you can do that through this surrender of control. This is a process, and this is not a linear process. You may be flowing through each of these steps all the time. The acceptance process is basically an acceptance of your flaws. I forgive myself for mistakes that I've made in the past. It can sound like I did the best that I could with the information that I had at that time. Peace, it's okay to relax. I don't constantly have to be on the lookout or performing or thinking about my past in order to give myself permission to relax. I can relax into this present moment. And then acceptance of life. So whatever your spiritual beliefs tell you about what life is, this acceptance of life has ups, life has downs, and we move through them instead of trying to avoid the bad and only accept the good. So ways to practice this are through journaling, observation, and therapy. Journaling helps you make connections between your thoughts and feelings. When you observe yourself in the world, you're watching your interactions and looking for patterns. This also helps to ground yourself in the present moment. And then in therapy, you're developing a safe space with another person who's non-judgmental, and you're going to be able to self-reflect in a safe environment. So you're going to be able to do the journaling and observations, bring it back to this non-biased person who can help you then develop an understanding of some of your cycles and patterns, so then that way you can start to break them. This is the journal that I created for this process of identifying thoughts and feelings. And the idea with this journal is that you would complete the same exercise over the course of a few weeks or months. So if you came up with a scenario every day, you might be able to get this done in a few weeks. If you did this weekly, it would take you a few months. But either way, you're developing an understanding for what thinking distortions you're using, and if you're using the same ones often, you're also practicing the difference between identifying thoughts and feelings. Here, if you have questions, if your thoughts come in the form of questions, you're teaching yourself to answer those questions, because sometimes the questions can be nothing but anxiety provoking type ruminations. But when you answer them, it sometimes helps calm the situation down and reframe it, so there's not this spinning of thoughts happening inside your mind. So I'm going to go through a couple of these examples to show you what it might look like to start to see a pattern in your thinking. So in the back of the journal, there is a poster and it lists all of the most common thinking distortions. The thinking distortions are your brain's version of a photo filter. So when you take a picture and you put a filter on it, it makes it look different than how the original image was captured. You can do the same thing with thinking distortions. So a situation can take place, but your brain will use these filters to make the situation look different to you than it might look to somebody else. Here's some examples of what each of these might look like in real life with someone who has an anxious attachment style. So polarized thinking is taking extreme positions with little regard for neutrality or middle ground. So an example might be this here. I have a you're with me or against me attitude about others. Loyalty is very important to me. I keep score in relationships. So this is how someone with an anxious attachment would use polarized thinking. So polarized thinking is very extreme in how they think. So there's a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things. And they don't have a lot of empathy or understanding for how somebody else might experience the same reality different than them. Mental filtering is only acknowledging evidence that supports what you already believe. So if somebody with an anxious attachment style was using this, they might say, my core belief is that people will leave me. So I only pay attention to evidence that supports this belief and I ignore the efforts of others. So when someone has an anxious attachment style and they're suffering with an abandonment that tells them that no matter what, they're going to end up alone, they will filter out nice things that people do for them. They'll filter out ways in which people are loyal to them, and they're only going to be able to see the evidence that supports this belief that I'm going to be left. And what happens is sometimes they end up in a self-fulfilling prophecy by becoming so anxious about these thoughts that people will leave me that they then become demanding of the relationships and the people do leave them, which only then furthers this belief. See, I knew it. People were going to leave me anyways. In Rule Master, this is the use of finite words like ought or must. The anxious person might say, I can be very critical and I have strict expectations of how things should be. This keeps me safe because I can anticipate and control outcomes. So somebody who has difficulty living in the present and accepting that sometimes you have good outcomes and sometimes you have bad outcomes might live with this very strict style of thinking. So they will think things like people should be respectful to others. You should follow the traffic rules. And so when they're in traffic and somebody doesn't, they have no flexibility in their thinking for why someone might break a traffic rule and they become triggered or angry. Because again, they didn't anticipate that, and their goal is to be able to control outcomes. So discomfort and uncertainty and things that are unexpected cause a big reaction from somebody who has an anxious attachment style or just uses one of these one of these thinking distortions. Next up is personalization. This is believing that everything others do and say is a reaction to you. So an anxious person might make a lot of assumptions about the intentions of others. And so they might say, well, you just did that, and then they'll fill in the blank, usually with something negative that supports some of these other beliefs that people don't love me, people don't respect me. Emotional reasoning is turning feelings into facts. I'm scared, therefore I must be in danger. This one took me a long time to understand because it kind of creeps into your thinking at times when you don't realize it. Emotional reasoning, turning feelings into fact. I'm scared, therefore I must be in danger. So sometimes you get anxiety and you feel scared even when there is no presence of danger. And so emotional reasoning tells you that your feelings equal fact. So I'm mad, so therefore I hit them. It's giving justification sometimes for your behavior because of your feelings. So in this case, someone with an anxious attachment style might say, because of my past, I assume that if I'm feeling insecure, it's because they've done something wrong. So in relationships, emotional reasoning will often start fights between two people because the person will use the fact that they don't feel connected or close to their partner as evidence that their partner has done something wrong, when sometimes the lack of emotional connection is due to the person's anxiety. Their anxiety is causing them to shoot way out into the future and start to future tell, so they're not being present in their relationship, which leaves them feeling insecure or disconnected. And then they make that mean, see, my partner has done something wrong, or this relationship is not right for me. So that's another example of emotional reasoning. So you're using your feelings, how you're feeling, to make that mean something about your environment. Mind reading is jumping to conclusions based on assumptions without evidence. So this person says, if I jump to, or I'm sorry, I jump to a lot of conclusions about the future and about what other people are thinking. So sometimes the anxious person will use this as a protective measure. So if I can try and guess or anticipate what another person is thinking, then I can mold my response to prevent danger, to prevent disconnection, any of those things. The problem with that kind of coping is that it ends up seeming calculated. And when you're calculated in a relationship, it prevents you from being vulnerable and present in building that connection with another person, whether it's a friend or a romantic partner or a boss or a colleague or anything really. Minimization is devaluing a personal achievement or dismissing the impact of your behavior. So someone who is very depressed and thinks that they're not good at things, and someone says, oh my gosh, you got that amazing award at work, they might say, oh, everyone gets that, or it wasn't that big of a deal, I had a lot of help on that project. Someone who is using it to dismiss the impact of their behavior, if someone comes to tell them, oh, you really hurt my feelings, they might say something like, it wasn't that big of a deal, or it was just a joke. So they'll use minimization in that way. The anxious person might disregard their resources and their positive experiences with others. So they have this belief, I'm not safe. And so they'll minimize all their experiences that tell them they are able to keep themselves safe and reasonably reach for resources when they need them. Magnification is exaggerating mistakes or events. This is also known as catastrophic thinking. So they might overestimate the risk of getting hurt. That's it, we should break up. So this is what it might look like in a relationship. And so if they have a small fight or a small argument, they may constantly shoot to this thinking of we should break up. So they're magnifying this event to make it mean something greater than it might. This can also look like thinking things are going to go awful. So if you have a meeting coming up at work, I'm going to do terribly. I'm not going to be able to perform. So you're magnifying or exaggerating the probability that something is going to go terribly wrong. Overgeneralization is making broad conclusions based on a single event. And so this person, I take a single event and make broad conclusions. This will always be this way. And so that keeps you in an insecure state of thinking if you believe things will always be this way, because that cuts out your motivation to continue trying different things. Labeling is assigning labels to self as and others. An example, calling yourself lazy for resting. And so this person who has an anxious attachment, they might assign people and experiences as good and bad as a shortcut to keep themselves safe. And so if this person does something that makes you uncomfortable, they get labeled as a bad person, they get placed in the bad box. It makes it easier for them to keep themselves safe, or they think they're keeping themselves safe. The problem is that people are multifaceted, and good people make mistakes and do bad things. So if they get placed in the bad box accidentally because this person isn't having a very flexible style of thinking, then that could prevent them from having relationships, and it could also shrink their world. So if they're constantly labeling others, then they're going to end up with a very small world, which can then make them feel unlovable, incapable, or just I'm not enough. And then they don't understand why, but oftentimes it comes back to these thinking distortions and the way that they're interpreting how these different events are happening to them in their lives. So this is at the back of the journal. This is the thinking distortions poster and then also the feel wheel. And these are going to be the tools that you're going to use to fill out this daily exercise or weekly exercise. But it's basically it's a thought journal. So you're identifying what your thoughts are in response to any given situation that happens in your life, and then you're doing a short thought evaluation to become more familiar with your style of thinking. There's a brief explanation in the beginning of the book. So do something today that your future self will thank you for. Our actions and decisions today will shape the way we will be living in the future. So completing this book or doing these exercises will help you identify now what some of these thinking distortions are. If you pick any of these distortions and you choose to work on one for a couple of months, it will help eradicate some of the others because they all kind of work together. So don't get overwhelmed with looking at this list and think that you need to memorize or know every single one. You can just work on personalization for a couple of months. I'm not going to take anything personally and just observe yourself practicing that and see what that does. Once you stop taking things personally, you'll have a less extreme response and a less extreme way of interpreting different things. So in the front, it gives you some brief instruction on how to use the journal. I can read those for you guys. It says, hello, I'm so happy you've chosen this journal. You are taking one of the first steps necessary for a happier, more peaceful life. Self-awareness is key when trying to make positive changes in your life. This journal will help you become aware of the negative habits you may have developed, such as mind reading, jumping to conclusions, or making a much bigger deal out of an issue than you need to. Scientists have studied the nature of our thoughts and have found that we have between 12,000 and 50,000 thoughts per day. And guess what? They're not all true. This journal will help you look at your thoughts objectively to see if you really believe them. If the thought is not true, what's a different way of looking at the situation? If the thought is true, what can you do about it? Replacing negative thoughts with more balanced thoughts will help train your brain to perceive things more neutrally. At the end of this journal, you'll find two helpful resources. The wheel is designed to help you become familiar with identifying a wide range of emotions. The Thinking Distortions poster will help you identify patterns of negative thinking. So you're first going to start off by identifying what event you're going to start with. And so the event can really be anything that triggers negative thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. The event can be a thought. For example, when you realize that it's Sunday and you have to work tomorrow. So that thought is the event that you can work out. It's really the event is anything that causes a negative reaction. Thoughts. What thoughts came up immediately following the event? If the thought is in the form of a question, answer it first before you evaluate it. For example, if the immediate thought is, why would he or she do that? Then answer it and fill in the thought. They did that because they don't like me. So that's a lot easier to evaluate than a question. The feelings, use feeling words such as rejected, annoyed, insulted, hurt, fearful, sad, abandoned, left out, unheard, misunderstood, confused, angry, and nervous. If you have other words that describe your experience, or if you find something different from the feel wheel, you'll use that as well. So here's the feel wheel. And then your response. So you're going to write as much as you can about what your response was. You can write down any physical, emotional, or behavioral response. For example, your heart was racing, you had a shortness of breath, crying, beating myself up is another response, shaming myself, overthinking, yelling, fighting, freezing, or running away. So there's a brief example of how someone might use this. So they're experiencing traffic on my way to work. Their first thought is, I'm going to be fired for being late. They're feeling nervous and agitated, and their response is their heart is racing, they're swearing, and they're also beating themselves up. So on top of being late, they're driving to work, just yelling at themselves the whole entire time. So coming home, they do this thought evaluation and they say, what makes me think this thought is true? My boss already hates me, and the last time I was late, she gave me a dirty look on my way in. Is there any evidence this might not be true? My coworkers are late all the time and haven't been fired. I have only been late 2 times this quarter. My boss is reasonable. If the thought is true, what resources do I have to support me? If I get fired, I could pick up more hours at my side job until I could find another full-time job. So the reason why this is helpful is because there is a probability. We don't know how things are going to go. We don't know if our job is secure all the time. So we're not going to just lie and tell ourselves, oh, everything will be fine. We also want to remind ourselves that there is a probability that this could go terribly wrong. And if the worst happens, these are the resources I can reach for. So this leaves them with more options. It's a more balanced way of thinking. Although being late will make me uncomfortable, it's not likely that I will be fired. So this is, again, getting someone used to being in uncomfortable situations. So it's never comfortable to walk in late. You may feel embarrassed, you may feel shame, but the reality is sometimes life happens and you are late. And so these are one of those situations where you can build tolerance to feeling uncomfortable. And if we flip back to our self-awareness sheet, that is one of the things that we're going to practice. And so in doing this journaling exercise, not only are you identifying your thoughts and feelings, you're also identifying maybe an intolerance to discomfort. So I don't like the feeling of disappointing someone else. I don't like the feeling of someone else being disappointed in me. And so because I don't have a lot of tolerance for that, it's making me very, very nervous and agitated about being on time. Whereas somebody who has a more secure sense of self, they may feel uncomfortable. They may feel that sense of urgency about getting to work, but they're not going to have this experience of beating themselves up and shaming themselves. They're going to know that mistakes happen and they're going to do the best they can to get there safely and as quickly as possible, and then deal with the discomfort of having the possibility that their boss might be disappointed with them. But they also know that there's a good possibility that their boss won't even notice. And so when someone has a healthy way of thinking, they can see that the worst could happen, I could get fired. The best could happen, my boss might not even notice. But what's likely is somewhere in the middle. They probably are going to notice. It's probably going to be mildly uncomfortable. And then after a few minutes, I'll get to work and it'll be fine. So that's the example that's in the book. And then there are several examples that I've done. These are all kind of made up examples, so they won't have a pattern reflected, but I'm gonna just go over a couple of examples to show more a variety of how you would complete this. In this example, the person is experiencing a flashback from an embarrassing moment that they had the week prior. So they start thinking, that was terrible. For all the work I'm doing on myself, I shouldn't have such a strong reaction. Maybe I'm not as healed as I thought. This is a common thought that people have when they're going through any kind of healing journey. When they have a setback or they have a reaction or an emotion that surprises them, they start to question their healing journey. Maybe I'm not as healed as I thought. This line of thinking leaves them feeling ashamed, sad, and remorseful. Their response is to beat themselves up. So they start saying things like this repetitively. Maybe I'm not as healed as I thought. They experience low motivation, so they don't want to journal, and they start thinking, what's the point? Their physical experience are anxiety symptoms like chest pressure. In the thought evaluation, they go with, I should not journal because it's not helping. So what makes them think this thought is true? If it were helping, I wouldn't have had such a strong reaction. I would be able to reach for my tools. Is there any evidence this might not be true? These kinds of things happen less often than they did before. They're also less severe and don't last as long. So this is really helpful because the person is evaluating the intensity, the duration, and the frequency. And so they're lowering their expectation that their that these types of emotions will never happen, and they're reasonably understanding and identifying that they're not happening as often, they're not as intense, and they don't happen with as much frequency as they used to. And so then that is the motivation that they need. That is the progress. So if the thought is true, what resources do I have to support me? I can journal about this experience. I can continue to practice breathing and slowing down in the moment. So they come up with the balanced thinking, keeping you, and they even jot down a little affirmation: progress, not perfection. So this is just reminding themselves that the goal of healing is not to be a perfect person. The goal of healing is to be able to move through the ups and downs of life, that the ups and downs are inevitable. And just because you're experiencing a down doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. It was never meant to be all up. And so this serves as a reminder for them. So when they're searching for patterns, they can start to see if they're using the rule master: I shouldn't have a strong reaction. Well, some days you might have a strong reaction, but when you have these rules about how you should or you shouldn't react to something, then when it falls outside those expectations, you're gonna feel this shame and sadness. So this person found out that someone is talking poorly about them, and their immediate thoughts were, what the heck? How could they? That's not true. I need to stop them. So they have this immediate, intense, and urgent reaction. These thoughts make them feel angry, they feel offended, and this is the key word: threatened. So when they think the thought, I need to stop them, it's because they're feeling threatened. They're feeling like something is imminent, something needs to be done. And so because of these thoughts and these feelings, this leads to the bodily response. So the body is preparing to be threatened. The body is preparing to defend itself. And so there's heart racing, crying, they're ruminating about what they could have said, they're thinking, what didn't they say, did other people believe them, and they're having this overthinking and ruminating about this idea that someone out there is talking negatively about them. So they start to consider calling the person and yelling at them, defending themselves, and calling all their mutuals to tell them the truth. So instead, they take to their journal and they evaluate the thought, I should stop them, right? Because if you start looking at how could, we're not going to sit there and try to figure out why someone did the thing that they did, right? No thought evaluation is going to give you any clarity on what someone else is thinking. But what you do have control over is this idea that I need to stop them. I need to do something about this. And so that's what we're evaluating. What makes me think this thought is true? They are spreading misinformation about me. People might believe them and think bad of me, and it could affect my relationships. So these are all really valid reasons. They're thinking that if there's this negative information about them, then it could affect the way other people see them. Is there any evidence that this might not be true? Well, my relationships are strong and I trust my relationships. I don't need to defend myself from gossip. Anyone that would allow gossip to affect our relationship is not someone I want in my life anyways. And this is a really, really tough thing to implement, this type of boundary in your life, because there are some people that would engage in gossip, and then you would have to make that hard choice about whether you want to forgive them and continue to be in their life, or whether you need to limit what you say around them or limit your experiences with them. So this can be a really hard thing. If the thought is true, what resources do I have to support me? Although it's uncomfortable to know that someone is saying bad things about me, I cannot control them. I can only control my reaction to what they do. So I'm never going to be able to stop somebody from doing negative things to me, but I can change how I respond to what they do. I can use my coping skills to tolerate the discomfort. So to tolerate the discomfort that someone is saying something negative about me, and there's really nothing that I can do to change that. So they end up with this balanced thought, let them, right? So let them say what they want to say, because them gossiping about me actually shows more negatively their characteristics. It shows them in a negative light because they're the ones saying bad things and engaging in gossiping, and I'm not engaging back. I'm not, saying negative things about them, and I'm just trusting in my relationships and trusting that things are, scratch that last part. I'm trusting in my relationships and trusting that if there were any information that was going to affect the way someone felt about me, that they would come to me and we would have a conversation about that. So that's that example. And again, when you're doing these exercises, the problem is not solved by doing the exercise. The person is still talking about you. You didn't do anything to stop them and you didn't do anything to prevent it. You're actually letting them. But what this does is it changes the response from this, right? From considering calling them, yelling at them, running around, doing all this urgent defense mechanism, scratch all that. It prevents you from this type of response. So this is a very anxiety fueled response of running to defend myself, call other people and tell the truth. It just brings a lot more anxiety and urgency to my situation than letting someone do what they're going to do anyways and releasing that control. So this is, okay, here's another one. Someone at work made a face while I was speaking, and the immediate thought was, they're judging me, and they shouldn't be, and they're right. In this example, someone at work made a face while it was my turn to speak at the meeting. Their immediate thoughts were, they're judging me. And what they made that mean is that A, they shouldn't be judging me, and B, that what they're judging me for could be true. So these two meanings are what are sparking the feelings of being very angry, irate, upset, sad, and feeling inadequate. They feel inadequate because they're wondering if what the person's judgments are actually true, and they're having this suspicion that whatever they're being judged for is true, and so they're feeling this shame about that. Their response is to give the person an attitude and discuss with coworkers what they did, and then go home and cry and think about it all night. So in this thought evaluation, they are using, they're judging me negatively and they shouldn't. So this would be the rule master. So people should not judge people negatively. So what makes me think this thought is true? They made the face while I was talking, and I didn't see them react that way to anybody else. So this means basically they must have been judging me. Is there any evidence this might not be true? I could be personalizing this. They could be having a reaction to the overall topic of the meeting and not necessarily me as a person. They could also be judging me. They could have thought that what I was saying was stupid, but just because they thought that what I was saying was stupid doesn't mean it actually was. They may be filtering what they're hearing me say through their own experiences, or they may be misunderstanding what I'm saying. If the thought is true, what resources do I have to support me? Well, my resources are my boundaries and communication. Breathing is my biggest resource in this scenario because it allows me to stay grounded even when someone or something is making me feel very uncomfortable. So the first thing I want to do immediately is get a hold of my breath and focus on my breath. If my breath can stay steady, my heart rate will slow down, and then I can think more clearly about what I want to do next. If I'm not thinking clearly about what I want to do next, I might immediately go discuss with coworkers and start a bigger issue than if I didn't do that. So this balanced thinking, once they've slowed down and been able to consider other possibilities, leaves them thinking people naturally judge others and circumstances as good or bad, safe or unsafe. Their opinions and judgments don't affect me or how I feel about myself. And then they're just reminding themselves about this acceptance and tolerance, right? So I have to be able to accept that I have flaws that others might see, and they may be judging me as good or bad. There's nothing I can do to control that. And then the tolerance of the discomfort that I might be being judged, and also tolerating the uncertainty that I might also not know. And sometimes I don't get to know the thoughts of other people. One thing that I used to use, a little reminder, other people's opinions are not my business. And so I would remind myself of that so that I could stay focused on, my own practice of identifying these thoughts and feelings, core beliefs, tolerating uncertainty and discomfort while surrendering control, and then accepting my flaws, accepting the ability to relax, and accepting life for what it is. So there are a bunch of these examples here. And so you would just go through and complete one thought evaluation per week, a couple a week. The more you do it, the quicker you'll find patterns. And then you can start observing those patterns in the world and starting to do things differently. That's all I'm going to do for today because I can't see a pattern in here. But I'll just show the book again. The Art of Mindful Thinking helps increase self-awareness by helping you identify your thoughts and your feelings in response to any given situation. Once you see a pattern in how you think and feel in response to situations, you'll start to notice a pattern in what your core beliefs are and also what you value. This exercise of identifying your thoughts and feelings and then moving through the thought evaluation and practicing getting to this balanced way of thinking also helps you surrender control and remind yourself that you actually very rarely are going to be able to predict the future. Accepting that helps you tolerate uncertainty and discomfort. The lack of tolerance for uncertainty and discomfort is what fuels a lot of people's anxiety. So working on this will really help your overall anxiety. And then acceptance of flaws. It's okay to relax, and whatever your life philosophy is spiritually about why things happen the way that they do. Or just mainly accepting that life is an up and down and that you're not always going to be able to experience only good things, that it is a flow and that you're going to have your down moments and you'll have your up moments, and that the goal is to be able to trust yourself through that process and through those experiences. If you're finding that you're not able to trust yourself or you're too far on one side or the other of the self-awareness scale, you can practice these things through journaling, observation of yourself out in the world, and therapy, which is a safe place for you to self-reflect on what you journaled and what you observed in the world.